Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this was a bit of an odd week. Feels a little bit quieter than it actually was for me, mostly because I couldn't quite catch up on everything I wanted to. Full-time job, even in quarantine, kept me busy working from home. But hey, trying times, we're doing the best we can here. So, for what we have, this is On the Pulse. Got 7 albums on the docket, so let's start off with, from R.A.P Ferreira, Purple Moonlight Pages.
To be such a little person, disappointment cloaks, resentment, wearing a cloak in Wegmans and being escorted out.
I've had some people asking about why I hadn't gotten to this one yet. Seriously folks, do you think I'm capable of rushing out a review for Milo, now known as R.A.P Ferreira, one of the more thoughtful and abstract indie rappers out today? I wanted to give this one some serious deeper attention and scrutiny, especially given how his last album, Budding Ornithologist or Weary of Tired Analogies, didn't quite connect as deeply as I was hoping. Now, granted, my issue last time was that the more I untangled the content, the less I liked him, so maybe heightened scrutiny isn't quite the answer, but he's also recruiting Kenny Siegel and the Jefferson Park Boys to amplify some of that jazzy side that I was lukewarm on last time, so maybe this would hit more effectively? Well, in parts it actually certainly does. Unlike most people, I'm very much on the fence about how much the jazz rap side works for R.A.P Ferreira in comparison with some of the glitchier electronics, and while his flows and delivery certainly have a lot more energy, there's an increasingly exaggerated theatricality that when combined with his usual tangled wordplay can get a bit distracting. It gives off the impression he thinks his artistry puts him on a different tier of insight and wisdom than his peers. And I'm not sure it does. Yeah, the vocabulary is rich as all hell, and it's certainly clever in a lot of the density and references, but I also look at A$AP Rock, or Homeboy Sandman, or Open Mike Eagle, who can be just as convoluted and dense, but never try to put themselves above their audience, and in recent years, they've actually embraced more accessibility. R.A.P Ferreira seems kind of dismissive of acts who get off on confessional prose poems, but that's because there's an emotional core in that music. That's why it works, even if the craftsmanship is rougher, and it's also just as valid. Now, to some extent, that's antithetical to the point he's trying to make, that the pure craft is often disrespected or devalued, especially when it becomes less about the craft itself and more about systemic barriers and privilege, especially when the sheer magnificence of the wordplay should be elevated, and yet you find some form of restless peace in that craft. Maybe that's enough, except for his constant desire to be understood in this form, which is a really potent form of artistic tension, except when he ends the album with the equivalent of a shrug and the creator's got a master plan, which screams of being a cop-out, and an album that will not try to be more disruptive. Which, okay, absolutely fine, it's not really trying to be, but he's once again manufacturing some of his own distance. Still though, when R.A.P Ferreira slides into an off-kilter vibe between vintage native tongues and diggable planets with mixes that are more spacious and textured, it does work, and it can lead to enough lonely greatness to resonate. Great late-night walk album if you can actually get out the house. Light 8 out of 10, check this out. Next up from Conan Gray, Kid Krow. This is probably the most requested album I've gotten across social media in recent memory, and I'll admit to being a little shocked by that. For those of you who don't know, he was a vlogger, but also a pretty serious musician in his own right. He's opened for Panic at the Disco, he's built a following and a pretty rabid fan base, so I was hoping this would be a short but interesting debut, and look, I'm not at all that impressed. What it reminds me of is a weird mishmash of 80s inspired and quasi-theatrical Gen Z pop, some of Billie Eilish's cadences and hushed delivery, and a lingering whiff of the fuckboy rap, minus the actual rapping. Now, part of this is just an immediate distaste for this guy's voice, a very willowy timbre that just doesn't have much intensity, made all the more blatant when he's expected to sell more loud, dramatic moments, and he's mixed in with a filter in a way to disguise how he really can't do it. But it also comes to some of the content. He's not really an active participant in most of his stories, and when he is, he's not all that likable. There's a petulance that creeps through that just sets my teeth on edge. His responses to exes potentially spreading lies about him or acting crazy he takes the high ground, and then he doubles down on the very same pettiness. And when you've got an album with so much of that, the sourness not conveyed well, it becomes a big problem. It's not the petty melodrama in and of itself, but how it's delivered for me. And while I've got issues with the production too, for the bedroom pop formula, it's pretty far from subtle or textured, while still having a lot of sloppy and cheap sounding percussion, and the bass presence is really inconsistent. By the time we get to the song Affluenza though, where the framing is less calling out the bullshit of that term and more playing sympathetic to the overprivileged rich Hollywood kids, no, I'm tapping out hard. Little League song was kinda cute though. This is a 4 out of 10, can't recommend it. Next up, from Fortet, 16 Oceans. So this was another opportunity for me to go in on a deep dive of an electronic artist I was only familiar with in passing, and going through the back catalog, I kinda wish I felt more than just lukewarm on this. Part of this is the feeling that his sound has shifted away from the jazzier, more organic crackle of his earliest projects like Dialogue and Pause, had a little bit more of an R&B vibe to them, for something that's more slivered and cool sounding and down-tempo, where the consistent dabblings with acoustic folk get a little more brittle and sharp. Which, yes, I can appreciate, I guess, but it doesn't really grip me as strongly as the electronic music I've come to love. It's melodically developed and very well mixed, but just a little bit distant for me. And unfortunately, it's kind of true with this project as well. It's a little pluckier, the keyboards feel a little more spare and glassy, the percussion is a bit more reserved, we get smatterings of field recordings and vocal samples and ambient touches to enhance a more meditative, down-tempo vibe, but it's also not all that interesting, with few distinctive highlights. At least for me, I prefer my down-tempo electronic music to have a core of texture or flow, or at least some sort of warmth that 16 Oceans just doesn't quite have. It's more meandering and scattered, and while that's pleasant, it doesn't really stick with me, again. And yet it's not quite as alien or crystalline in the vein of, I don't know, Visible Cloaks to really wow me there either in the experimentation. Not helped by a lot of the vocal fragments that are here to accentuate some of that humanity, but just wind up feeling all the more out of place, especially against the glitchy elements. It's also not helped by some small clusters of track fragments that don't really add up to anything. They're more interludes, but they don't really build or enhance the flow of the project, or even feel that well positioned. Overall though, it's fine. I think the longtime fans will like it okay, but if I want my down-tempo electronica in 2020, I'm gonna stick with Spunk Shine. 6 out of 10 though, if you're curious. Next up from Lauv, How I'm Feeling.
Buy some things we don't need. Bring your mother's dog, your paintbrush and some candy.
I heard about the backlash to this project even before I heard it. That the extended drip feed of singles had underwhelmed pretty much everyone and led to a project that was way too long and way too basic for its own good. And I'm sitting back here with the observation, well, yeah, that's been true about Lauv since he started. I put him in a similar category as Bozzy, or even a fair few of the current generation of bedroom pop acts with a homegrown, kind of ramshackle monogenre approach, and where a lot of the twee smallness, the hashtag basic content, and the shaky construction kind of part of the point, for better and for worse. So the sophomore album to follow in that lane doesn't surprise me, and honestly, it's not all that far removed from what we got on I Met You When I Was 18. Now, it's hard not to notice how some of the problems are magnified here. We have 21 songs, the album's over an hour, and where the last Lauv project elevated this with songs that picked up brighter melodies or slightly more propulsive grooves, this is a project that is sliding towards minimal restraint, with increasingly spare and pseudo-lo-fi arrangements, which start to run together and lose their luster when you have nearly 24 of them and not a lot of variation. Which is kind of a shame, because in Lauv's quavering wistfulness in the vein of Shawn Mendes, it's not a bad fit for a slightly more detailed, albeit the definition of basic, style of writing, and this guy can write decent hooks. And hell, the homegrown, messy situations of anxiety, drug abuse, longing for closeness in a real relationship, and existential emptiness where even the online experience and connections aren't working, there's a decent core there, especially with way too much self-awareness and framing that's not about to treat him as much of a protagonist. But this circles back to my larger issue with the project as a whole. We got a lot of skeletons of short but potent songs that are really dependent on the producers to elevate them to greatness, which when you have John Bellion or Michael Elizondo on production, or you got guest stars like Alessia Cara or BTS, or even Troye Sivan, you get brighter moments, but they're few and far between on a lot of clumsily mixed songs with the monsters and strangers with a lot of tinny pickups and underweight melodies. Still, those good moments are often just good enough to push this to an extremely light 6 out of 10, even though I think I'm being generous indeed. Next up from Kelsea Ballerini, Kelsea.
When somebody's mean, where do you hide?
It feels weird that I've been quietly in Kelsea Ballerini's corner since she started putting out projects, never quite loving her strain of pop country, but there have been measurable improvements, and there's been a streak of sharper insight that's run just below the surface and is seldom praised, even by the country critics. So again, I actually had expectations that she would continue the upward trajectory from Unapologetically, and sadly that didn't quite happen, because Kelsea is all over the damn place. Because on the one hand, it's got some of the more detail-rich songwriting and warmer tones I like from her countryside, which are the easy highlights for me, placed alongside the clunky trap pop songs that either sound imported from the mid-2000s, feel like lesser versions of Lucy Hale songs from 2014, or this weird point of discomfort with actually being pop songs. She doesn't want to go to the club, she's got a weird relationship with LA, she plays the other girl opposite Halsey even as they try to make 2020's Does He Love You? It's putting forward an image that she wants to peel back. Hell, that was a through line of her lead-off single Homecoming Queen, Expose More Humanity, even as the music is reinforcing the image. And it's odd because this album does have a comfort zone in country, and I'd argue that Kelsea Ballerini's got an emotional intelligence in her songwriting that's always punched above her weight class, and she doesn't get credit for it, and that makes me question how much the label was pushing for the pure pop pivot in sound thanks to her collaborations, or playing in the same territory as Maren Morris, which is all the more painfully ironic because with the Highwomen, Maren Morris is making the best music of her career. But honestly, I wouldn't have minded the pop pivot if it didn't feel like across the entire album, the percussion is increasingly overmixed and programmed. This isn't Joey Moy production, you don't need to pull cues from him there. And all this leads to the frustrating feeling that for trying to find a sound to call her own on a self-titled album, Kelsea Ballerini kind of took a step back with this. It's a strong 6 out of 10, there are highlights, but I'll admit, I expected more. Next up from Donald Glover, 3/15/20. I didn't expect this to get a full-length public release, because Donald Glover is the sort of artist who will just leak something abstract or weird in a place and then yank it from distribution just because he can, especially as he's retired his Childish Gambino moniker, but it looks like his label wanted something to be accessible here, so after he put the entire album on this website for last weekend, it's now finally hit streaming sites, and that means I can talk about it, and in a way I kinda get why Donald Glover wanted this away from the Childish Gambino name, because that might have set expectations that this album absolutely does not reach. Forget the fact that he's not rapping much at all, or that this clearly doesn't have the ambition or swell or scope of Awaken My Love or Because the Internet, even by the standards of meandering vibe albums where this project clearly wants to reside. What it reminds me most of was the Donnie Trumpet and the Social Experiment album from 2015, Surf, where all the loose, offbeat sloppiness got a pass and eventually wound up as a lot less than the sum of its parts. And it's not because the central idea behind many of these parts is bad, and showing the juxtaposition of the existential emptiness and the black experience and some of the horrible things people have had to do to survive and still have to find some vestige of happiness, and the larger question of predetermination has him wondering if folks even have a choice, and that can lead to some stark and really subtle moments if you're reading between the lines. Shame the production is a complete mess. I had issues with the vocal filters on the last album, and now not only are they back in spades, they sound more tinny and canned than ever, as do any of the acoustic guitars. Yeah, there are some stabs at funk and some shuddering, glitchy electronics that feel incredibly stiff and lacking texture and featuring transitions and outros that go on way too long and fracture a lot of the vibe. For a project like this, you would think there'd be some sort of organic warmth or subtle grit, if only to round out some of the sharper edges, but since this production has been an issue with Childish Gambino for years now, I gotta repeat myself again. It's really damn clunky. And yes, as much as some of that clashes might be part of the point, even for showing the constant niggling disruption of that vibe, it also sacrifices that flow, which is arguably more valuable, and exposes this as just more undercooked and underwritten B-sides cobbled together with a loose idea that feels increasingly tenuous. All of which hit way harder with This Is America 2 years ago, which is when the first single from this project was released with Feels Like Summer, which is probably still the best song here. So yeah, 5 out of 10 for me. Take it or leave it. And finally, from The Weeknd, After Hours.
All this money and this pain got me heartless. All life, 'cause I'm heartless.
There's a part of me that feels weird reviewing albums by The Weeknd. I tend to be really positive on the singles or a few scattered deep cuts, but I'd also argue he hasn't really made a fully great project since Thursday or Echoes of Silence. And thus when I saw the avalanche of hype for the new project, writing some of his best lead-off singles to date, I was excited, but I also knew to temper my expectations. And that might have been the right idea, because while this album is probably his most cohesive to date in terms of flow and theme and idea, it doesn't seem to have any obvious duds in the same way previous projects did. Why do I have the strange feeling that this should be hitting me way harder than it is? I know The Weeknd got criticized on his last 2 albums about going too pop, but at least provided him an incentive to structure some tighter hooks. What I took issue with was falling towards lethargic, softer sounds that could get really tedious. This is not that for the most part, but that's because The Weeknd is embracing a suffocating, flagrantly 80s inspired synthwave palette that often feels cranked to the most massive size possible. Not always to the album's benefit, I should add, when the cheaper trap drum machines are mixed just as tightly right at the front, and that's not even touching on how many swampy layers The Weeknd's voice is drowning in. I mean, it sounds expensive, but it's also overmixed to be a lot at once. And I can't deny that it doesn't quite have the same bite as some of the rickety, darker atmospherics I've loved from him. More than ever, it's a project that wants to envelop every corner of the experience with The Weeknd's fractured, reckless angst, with no guest stars or other voices in the room as he claws his way through a bad relapse, and the brutal conflict between his own rapacious urges and the fragments of better judgment to let this girl just move on with her life, especially when he knows just how much of a hollow of mirrors he's wallowing in and could drag her back. And the moments of shameless excess like the lead-off singles and Faith, and even the heel turn on Escape from LA, if enough structure is there to support the atmosphere, it works incredibly well. But let's not ignore how this is not an unfamiliar arc for The Weeknd. This is territory he's touched before, nor is the writing as detailed or as flagrant, which can make sense in the numbness of an overdose, but it also means chunks of this album can run together pretty fast. But at the end of the day, The Weeknd would prefer to tear away this relationship for good, even if it leaves him bleeding out. Now, I want a self-sacrifice that doesn't feel really earned after the gaslighting of Repeat After Me, but it does make sense on a project that's drowning in its own ego. And you know, even if that's the point on the project, it is probably his best since Trilogy. It also reminds me a little bit of Phantoms by Marianas Trench as a coda to an established story that frankly should have ended sooner. And even if that's the point too, to me it's not quite a transcendent experience. It is good, not quite great yet. 7 out of 10 though, you probably heard it. Check it out. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Still working through my schedule here. Once again, I have to stress, if Patreon becomes an issue for anyone who's actually looking to support me at this time, pull back on it. I get we're in trying times, and hey, I'll be just fine on my own here. But if you do want to support me, link to my Patreon's right over there, where you guys get to add albums to my schedule. Really happy and really grateful for all of it. Beyond that, I'm sure I said some controversial things. Comments down there. Have fun. But until then, I'm Mark. This is On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.